On the 19th of October, a family man in the Norwegian city Kingsburg hung up caricatures of Muhammed at various places around town. Later that same night, 4 police officers showed up at his door and threatened family man with criminal prosecution. The crime family man had supposedly committed was hanging up posters without permission. In my opinion, that charge was obviously contrived. Everyone knows that the only reason those cops acted as they did was because the posters in question contained caricatures of a specific religious figure. Thanks to HRS's original interview with Family Man, which I covered in my previous video, this case has gained a lot of domestic attention. So much attention, in fact, that hanging up Kurt Vestergaard's Muhammad caricature seems to have become something of a meme. Prior to the Family Man incident, these posters had only been observed in Lillestrøm and Kingsburg. However, as of the 27th, HRS reports that the caricatures have been spotted in a handful of new cities, including Oppegård, Lørenskog, Molde, Røros, and Oslo. HRS was contacted by one of the individuals responsible for hanging up the caricatures in Oslo, and the reasons this person gave for doing so are fascinating. Apparently, this individual, along with 2 of his friends, decided to emulate Family Man by hanging up the caricatures as an act of solidarity for Samuel Paty. Furthermore, he describes their actions as, quote, a fight for the freedom of speech, which is under pressure owing to the emergence of Islam. HRS goes on to write, quote, he emphasizes that the trio, none of whom are political extremists in any fashion, have also discussed that lives may be lost just as they were in France. Resistance people during World War II were also killed. This is our time's most important fight for freedom, the fight against the Islamic darkness, he says. Furthermore, the man is of the opinion that what we are witnessing in the West now is a clash of civilizations. Islam's values are to the West's fundamental freedoms what oil is to water, he proclaims. He then questions what it will take for the politicians to, quote, wake up and take Islam seriously. So, while I was reading this, I couldn't help but reflect on the phrase, none of whom are political extremists in any fashion. I understand what the person who wrote this means, but I also know a lot of people who would hear things like fight for freedom, Islamic darkness, resistance, and so on, who think that that language in and of itself is evidence that this person is obviously a far-right extremist. In my view, that's an absurd position to hold. Because, this whole trend started because a man from the Middle East was worried that he and his children would have to live under Sharia law here in Norway as well. I literally know ex-Muslims who are political refugees from places like Iran who would use exactly the same sort of language as we have just heard. But hey, I guess being an ex-Muslim means that you're a far-right fascist, right? Woke politicians are the perfect segue into our next case, namely the circumstances surrounding the appearance of the caricatures in Røros. In this HRS article, published on the 25th, we are informed that the Muhammad caricatures were hung up at 3 locations in Røros the preceding Thursday night. 2 of the locations were buildings owned by local newspapers, and the third was at a local store currently being renovated by politician Bjørn Salvesen. Salvesen was formerly a member of Norway's Socialist Left Party, but is currently an independent. He believes that the people responsible for hanging up the caricatures come from a, quote, radical right-wing political environment. Salvesen called for a press conference where he has said the following, quote, this is obviously about immigration. I have belonged to a party and still belong to a social circle that is immigration-friendly. Too friendly in somebody's view. I interpret this event as an attack against me as a politician in that context. He continues, this is a drawing that actually takes lives, and this is very serious. As a politician, it is unacceptable to be met with such provocation. Somebody might interpret this to mean that I was the one who hung up the caricatures, right? And that makes this very serious. That would make other people furious. Our new countrymen should feel safe and welcome here. Salvesen concludes by stating that hanging up the drawings is legal, but adds, quote, given that these drawings have so many problematic aspects to them, I think it crosses the line. I believe that what we are seeing here is a textbook case of slimy, disingenuous politician syndrome. In a desperate attempt to avoid pointing out the obvious, he has to pretend that Muhammad caricatures magically spring to life before taking lives. He can't even bring himself to admit who specifically these caricatures infuriate. Instead, he frames these drawings as an attack directed at him. It seems to me that he might be insinuating that somebody is trying to get him killed without admitting who would be doing the killing. He then regurgitates the platitude about how our new countrymen should feel safe and welcome. But I actually agree with him on that point. I believe that when Norway takes in ex-Muslims as political refugees, those individuals should absolutely feel safe and protected enough to be able to hang up Muhammad caricatures without fearing that somebody will murder them for doing so. Unfortunately, something tells me that this is not the sort of safety Salvesen is arguing for. If we as a society were really serious about providing the sort of safety he is advocating for, I believe that would eventually involve executing ex-Muslims for being apostates. Look at it from a devout Muslim's point of view. What could possibly be more terrifying and dangerous than an ex-Muslim? If you believe that the most important goal in life is getting into heaven whilst avoiding hell, then imagine the horror you would experience at the prospect of your children being influenced by an apostate. The natural conclusion, therefore, is to get rid of the apostates. If you think this line of reasoning is hyperbole, then let me remind you that this is literally, the reason for why we grant ex-Muslims asylum to begin with. Salvesen is not the only politician who has reacted to the caricatures. Per-Willy Amundsen, a spokesperson for the Progress Party and a former Minister of Justice, seems to have taken a particular interest in Family Man's case. In an interview with HRS, he describes the police's actions against Family Man as a, quote, obvious abuse of power. In the same interview, Amundsen goes on to say, quote, it seems incomprehensible that no fewer than 4 police officers would spend their time on a non-case like this, whilst the police too often lack the capacity to respond to serious criminal cases. It's simply unbelievable. HRS writes that Amundsen sees this case as so principally important that he intends to bring it up with the current Minister of Justice Monica Mæland at the next parliamentary congregation. Quote, the treatment of Family Man in Kingsburg is totally unacceptable. I expect the police to give an unconditional apology, but regardless, I will still bring this case before Congress. Erna and Monica must take responsibility. The freedom of speech must be defended, and the funding allocated for fighting so-called Muslim hate must cease. The police must prioritize real crime that impacts real people, not insults to fantasy figures. Our freedom and rule of law will never falter in the face of a minority's easily offended religious feelings. Amundsen has since formally submitted a written inquiry to Mæland, which is expected to receive an answer during next week's parliamentary session. The question reads as follows, quote, will the minister ensure that the police apologize for having intervened against lawful utterances, instruct the police that such incidents shall not take place in Norway, and explain under what conditions the police are allowed to intervene and censure critical statements directed at Islam? Now, when it comes to Family Man himself, new details regarding his interaction with the 4 police officers have come to light. According to Family Man, one of the officers is supposed to have said, quote, we can't have crazy Trump supporters running around and hanging up posters. Family Man tells HRS that, quote, it didn't hit me there and then. I'm neither a Trump fan nor a Sion supporter. I'm a singular individual who likes to form my own opinions. In retrospect, however, I have reflected on how politically motivated the police appear to be when they say things like that. I am against groupthink. I don't belong to the far right. I'm just an ordinary person and an individual. The police are supposed to defend the citizens' freedom of speech on a principled basis. This is not about me as a person. This is only about principles. That is why the police should, on a principled basis, apologize to the entire population for their behavior. Family Man goes on to explain that he is motivated not only by everyone who agrees with him, but also all those who don't speak their minds out of fear that they might lose their jobs or face social exclusion. He concludes with, quote, many are afraid of not being perceived as politically correct. The final update for today is that Family Man has now received unconditional apologies from Øyvind Aas, regional leader for the Southeastern Police District, and from Håvard Drevo, chief of police in Kingsburg. If you consider Family Man an extremist, then you have lost the plot. If you care about protecting minorities, then what these police officers did should cause you to feel indignant. If people like him can't find protection in a place like Norway, what do? Who can possibly help them if not us?